Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's current seminar. Today we have two speakers, two talks. Our first speaker is Professor Zhizhen Zhao. She will be giving a talk on towards hierarchical flow matching for generative modeling. Zhizhen Zhao is an associate professor and William L. Everett Flow in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she has been a faculty member since 2016. Prior to joining UIUC, she was a current instructor at the Current Institute of Mathematical Science, New York University from 2014 to 2016. She earned her bachelor's and master's degree in physics from Trinity College, Cambridge University in 2008 and completed her PhD in physics at Princeton University in 2013. She is a recipient of the Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellowship 2020. Her research interests span computational imaging, cryo-electron microscopy, single particle analysis, data science, and machine learning. With that short introduction, the floor is yours and you can start your presentation.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation and introduction. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the hierarchical flow matching. So specifically, I will talk about two topics. One is the vanilla version of the hierarchical flow matching, and then the second part is of hierarchical flow matching with mini-batch couplings. So this is a joint work with students Yi Zhang and Yi Ziyan, and also a collaborator in UIUC, Alexander Schwing. And so, what is generative modeling? So if on the right-hand side, I show a very simple example. So suppose we have access to those green dots, like they are the data sets that we have. They are actually drawn from an underlying mixture of two Gaussians. We would like to learn a model that can generate new data that looks like a given set of data points. One thing to note is that in practice, we are given data points instead of the underlying distribution. So on the right-hand side, basically, we would like to get or generate a data point that looks like the blue circle instead of a red circle. So how can we achieve this? So there are many existing generative models that aims to achieve this. So for example, we can use a single Gaussian to model the data. We can use Gaussian mixtures and also variational autoencoders normalizing flows, generative adversarial networks, diffusion models, flow matching models. There is a very long list of models, and they span across different like a complexity or model architectures. So each model comes with some pros and cons. So for example, single Gaussian is very simple. You just need to estimate the mean and the variance, but it can't capture the multimodality of the data. And for Gaussian mixtures, you need to estimate the means and variances for each component of the mixture. And you usually have to guess the number of mixtures for the data. For variational autoencoders, it is more flexible than the previous two models. However, people always see that the generated images are with very low quality, like they are more blurred. Now, people also look into normalizing flows. So for the traditional normalizing flows, we know that the architecture are restrictive to the invertible functional class. Then people also look into the generative adversarial networks, but the training for GANs is usually unstable, and it's pretty hard to train such big models. Most recently, people look into diffusion models and flow matching models, and those two models have outstanding performance for image generations. And so I believe there are many more new models coming in the next few years. So for this talk, we are going to focus more on the flow matching models. So there are a lot of applications with diffusion and flow matching models. So for example, we can see text to video modeling and text to image models. So for example, you put instruction of saying, let's generate a space station that looks like a pretzel. So then you get such image from those generative models. So we can also use such model to for protein generations. So for example, we can generate protein backbone locations. And so that's very useful for small molecule discoveries. And also people have used such model into in the robotic action models. So there are a lot of applications of generative modeling. So specifically in this talk, we are focusing on flow matching based generative modeling. So for generating new data points, the flow-based models usually start from, say, some vector z0 drawn from some simple prior distribution, rho 0, and push those samples forward from t is equal to 0 to t is equal to 1 via integration along the trajectory specified by a learned velocity field. So it can be illustrated using this diagram. So we draw a, say, Z0 from a simple Gaussian from rho 0, and then we learn a trajectory to push those points from this rho 0 to a target distribution point. So Z1, which is a dog image in this illustration. So concurrently in 2023, 3 papers have illustrated very similar ideas that basically we want to learn this velocity field from the training data and then use it for generative modeling. Okay, so how do we achieve this? So one way is, let's say we use flow matching with linear interpolation. So for the training data, if we have a set of X1s, which may be dog or natural images, we can basically interpolate from the noisy images, so X0, with the target image through this linear interpolation, which is 1 minus t times X0 plus t times X1. So for any time t between 0 and 1, we can get a very easily interpolated point xt that can be used in our training. So, so then for this ground truth velocity field, so which is the derivative of xt with respect to t, then we get that from this expression. Basically, the ground truth velocity for any paired data point is x1 minus x0 under the linear interpolation. So then the training, because we want to learn the corresponding velocity field for transporting from rho 0 to rho 1, then the training is basically find such velocity field that can minimize this mean squared error term. So which is x1 minus x0, which is the ground truth velocity, minus our model v at location xt and time t. Okay. So the optimal solution for this training is the expected velocity field. So in other words, it is the expectation of the ground truth velocity given all the pairs of x0, x1, t, such that it satisfies this linear interpolation formula. Right. So essentially what you can see is basically you have different pairs of points passing through the same xt location. However, we need to take the average. So this is the expected velocity instead of the true velocity field. So it is very simple and easier to build compared to the previous models like traditional normalizing flow. It has faster sampling than diffusion model because we are basically running an ODE instead of an stochastic differential equation simulation. So it also comes with an exact likelihood estimator because we can use the transport equation or continuity equation to evaluate the likelihood of a generated data. So to be more specific, okay, here is an illustration. So at time is equal to 0, we have, let's say we have a source distribution, rho 0, which corresponds to a mixture of two Gaussians. So here the black points are drawn from the mixture of two Gaussians. And at time is equal to 1, it corresponds to our target distribution, which is the points that we want to generate. Here we use again a mixture of two Gaussians. On the left-hand side for figure A, I'm showing you the path for the defined by the linear interpolation. So it's essentially directly linking linearly the point at time is equal to 0 to a point in time at 1. Right, so you see that you have this kind of crossing behavior because of the data set that I choose to show. Essentially, you have this mixture, because of the mixture of Gaussians, here you can see this crossing. So one thing to note is that if we look at any particular data point, right, so for example, in the middle, and for time is equal to 0.5, you can see the velocity can point to the left and to the right, right? So if we want to use the original flow matching or rectified flow, what happens is for this particular point, let's say at time is equal to 0.5 and location is 0, the velocity will be just equal to get to 0. So therefore, the resulting rectified flow path looks like the figure B, right? So basically, you will get a curved path, right? So as the previous paper has shown, capturing the mean velocity distribution is sufficient for characterizing the multimodal data distribution. So you can use that learned velocity to still generate data points, and the corresponding generated data follows the target distribution. But one observation is that because the rectified flow paths are non-crossing because you are using the expected velocity field, it often leads to very curved forward integration paths. So what does that mean? If your path is very curved, in the sampling stage, you need a lot of integration steps in order to follow this trajectory to get the desired generated point. So meaning that the number of neural functional evaluation is large. So now the question is, can we develop other methods to alleviate it or to change the sampling procedure, right? To reduce the number of these integration steps. So what we have proposed is that we introduce the hierarchical rectified flow to accurately model the multimodality of the velocity itself. So for example, in the previous illustration, what we have seen is that is at time is equal to 0.5 and location like middle, like 0. Essentially, you can see that the velocities, you have like plus and minus some values, right? In the rectified flow, you are just going to get one value, let's say 0. And in the HRF, essentially what we are doing is we can draw from the underlying velocity distribution and such that we can get path that can cross, right? So here we can see that our generation is a bit like a stochastic, right? But the resulting path essentially can cross from bottom left to top right and bottom right to top left. So later in the talk, we are going to show that it will result in some nice properties for the generated data points. So any questions so far? Okay, so
Hi. Maybe I have a question. So just to make sure that I understood the main idea of the part C is that we avoid the integration, right? So it will not be as slow because I said that for the rectifier flow, when you have the curve, that integrating will become expensive, right? Integrate the trajectory. So when you do the HRF, then but in some sense it looks somehow similar to the linear one. I mean, visually,
Yeah, visually it looks pretty similar to the linear interpolation, which is, in fact, here in the HRF illustration, the time steps that we take for the simulation is just 10 time steps. So you can see that I will show you why we can get such a plot later in the talk. And indeed, we want to really mimic the performance of the linear interpolation. But the difference between A and B is due to the fact that in model B, we are learning the mean of the velocity distribution. It's sufficient for capturing the actual target data distribution. The problem is really like, how can we avoid such curved path that maybe require a lot of integration steps during the sampling?
oh, okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, this is Lulu from Yale. So just to clarify, so in this case, so you are not predicting the V, you are predicting a distribution for the V, right?
Right. So in the HRF, we would like to model the multimodal distribution for velocity and use it to do data generation. And we will also show that the generated data distribution follows the true target data distribution.
I see. But would this make the training harder? Because yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. We can see later in the talk. Yeah.
Okay, thank
That's a
you.
very good question. Yeah. Yeah, so now let's look at what is actually the velocity distribution that is induced from this linear interpolation, right? So suppose, let's say x0 and x1 are independently drawn from rho 0, which is the source distribution, and rho 1 is the target distribution that we want to model. And the velocity distribution, that we call it pi1 v at location xtt, is induced by the linear interpolation is the following. So on the numerator, it is essentially rho 0 times rho 1, and in the denominator, we have rho t, which is the marginal distribution at time t for the interpolated point at xt. So this is defined for rho txt that is not equal to 0. And since rho txt is just a linear combination of x0 and x1, we can write out the explicit formula for it. Then now the interesting part is how does it pi1 look like, right? So note that since rho 1 is typically multimodal, and the resulting pi1 is also multimodal. So at time is equal to 0, so that is starting from the source distribution, we can see that the pi1, the velocity distribution at location x0 and 0, is just a shifted version of the data distribution by x0. And at time is equal to 1, the velocity distribution corresponds to a shifted version of the source distribution so it's like a flipped version and then shifted by x1. Right, so that's in the two ends, we know how they look like and they correspond to the source or the target distributions. And to clearly see what's happening, let's look at a simple example. Let's suppose rho 1 is a mixture of Gaussian, mixture of k Gaussians, and rho 0 is just a standard Gaussian. So then in this case, pi1 is, we can show that pi1 is still a mixture of Gaussians, right, with different weights that we can compute. More specifically, let's look at the picture. So here we show you 4 velocity distributions that at different space and time location. So for example, the first one, we are at location -1 and 0. So you can see that this is a shifted data distribution. and shifted by 1, right? So basically we have this a mixture of two Gaussian that corresponds to a shifted row 1. And here, blue line is our analytical expression from the previous slide, and the orange one is the samples that we can get, is evaluated from the samples. So, and then we can look at location 0 and time is equal to 0.4. We can see that this is still a mixture of two Gaussians. Now, for location at 0.5 and t is equal to 0.6, we can see that this is now, instead of mixture, like an equal weight mixture of two Gaussians, we can see one mode is more prominent than the other mode. And then the last one is at t is equal to 1. You can see that this is a flipped and shifted version of the source distribution. So this is just to sanity check that our derivation is correct. And then this we can clearly see that the velocity distributions can be multimodal. So now the key question is it possible to capture the multimodal velocity distribution at each time t and at each location xt? Are there any benefits to capture the multimodal velocity distribution as opposed to just using its mean? Because it's easier, probably looks easier to just compute its mean, right? So intuitively, what we see is an accurate characterization of the velocity distribution might be beneficial because we can obtain straighter integration paths, which in turn may lead to easier integration with fewer neural function evaluations, meaning that you go through the neural networks less number of times. So capturing the velocity distribution provides additional modeling flexibility. Here, in a sense, we can have like the time axis tau instead of, in addition to the original time t for the velocity. This might yield to improved results. Now, to accurately model the ground truth velocity distribution, we can use rectified flow matching, or other similar ideas for velocities instead of the locations. So this is equivalent to, say, learn the acceleration using linearly interpolated velocity samples. So here I want to clarify that the quotation marks is that the acceleration is not the second order derivative of x, because here in xt, we know it's linearly interpolating between x0 and x1. It doesn't have second order derivative with respect to t. Here, the acceleration really means the difference in terms of the velocity. And then more clearly, how do we do this? So to learn the acceleration, we introduce a source velocity sample. Say v0 is drawn from an underlying source distribution for velocity pi 0. Construct a target velocity samples, v1, from this velocity distribution pi 1 at time t and at location xt. We can introduce a new time axis tau, similar to t, and construct a tau-dependent velocity. So here, this is essentially a linear interpolation of the velocity samples. Right. So then we can show that the ground truth acceleration is essentially x1 minus x0 minus v0. Right. So this is how we define the acceleration in this context. So in a sense, now we are using flow matching idea to get the expected acceleration field. Now, how do we do that? Okay, so similar to what how the flow matching computes the expected velocity field, right? We can get the expected acceleration is essentially v1 minus v0, given v tau is equal to u tau, right? Take the expectation. Now we can rewrite this formula by just using the fact that v1 is equal to x1 minus x0 by the linear interpolation. And then the expectation is now over pi 0, rho 0, rho 1. Okay, so then using this expected acceleration field, we can see that the following ODE using the A acceleration can convert your source velocity u0 to a target velocity that is drawn from the underlying velocity distribution pi 1. That that basically follows the same argument from flow matching. Now, so how do we do the training, right? So we can apply the flow matching to learn the expected acceleration to model the velocity distribution at location xt and at time t. So basically, now the training objective becomes the following. So we draw x0 and x1 from the source and the data distribution. Now t and tau are drawn uniformly from 0 to 1. And now we also have the source distribution for v0. So v0 is drawn from another source distribution from which can be, say, for example, Gaussian. Now, typically, we use a neural network to model, to parameterize A, and then we can just rephrase this as, minimizing with respect to theta. Okay, so now once we have the trained acceleration field, say A, how can we use it for data generation? So first, we can see that, just reiterate what we have said before, we can use A to generate a velocity u1 from the velocity distribution pi1. So therefore, for the data generation, essentially, we can use this coupled ODE to get the data points. So essentially, we can use A to first generate a sample of velocity at location ZTT, and then using this velocity to propagate our samples in the data space. Okay, so what are the properties of this generated flow? So we can show that the time differentiable stochastic process, ZT, defined for t is from 0 to 1, generated by the previous coupled ODE, has the same marginal distribution as the time differentiable stochastic process defined by the linear interpolation. So that's why I think Juan was saying that for the previous illustration, we can see that the HRF generated path looks like the original linear interpolation. So now, how can we prove this theorem? So we can consider the characteristic function of our random variable z at time t plus delta t. So this is essentially just zt plus the random variable v times delta t. So assuming that zt has the same distribution as xt. So if the characteristic functions of those two agree, then we can show that they basically enjoy the same distributions. In addition, if we can, since z0 and x0 have the same distributions, we can get that zt and xt have the same distributions for any time t between 0 and 1. So how can we show that zt plus delta t and xt plus delta t agree? So to show this, now let's look at the characteristic function, right? So it is essentially here, the first equality, I just plug in zt plus delta t is just equal to zt plus v times delta t. Now take the double integral, right? We plug in the distribution for the velocity and then the distribution for xt. So because we are saying that zt and xt has the same distribution. So now for the equality A, right, we basically use the fact that the expression for the velocity distribution. Now rearranging this by plugging in xt minus tv is equal to x0 and xt plus 1 minus t times v is equal to x1. Then we get that the characteristic function of this capital Z and capital X actually agree. So that completes the proof. So essentially what we can say is at each time point, you can see the marginal distribution, but for both processes actually agree. Okay, so what else can we say about the path of the generated samples? So the generation of data is governed by, we can view it, it's governed by a random differential equation instead of a stochastic differential equation with the random velocity field. So the randomness comes from the initial conditions for data and for the velocity. So if we start with samples ZT from rho t, drawn from rho t, we propagate each sample by V times delta t, right? Now, since we know V is equal to x1 minus x0, where you have this relation for ZT is and linear interpolated from the source distribution x1 and x0 and the target distribution target point x1. So basically, a straight path following the velocity that you draw will lead to a sample from the data distribution. So in other words, in this framework, essentially, if you can learn the velocity distribution really well, you can choose any arbitrary delta t. So in other words, if we think about, if we start at time is equal to 0, essentially you can have one-step generation if you trust your zero-time velocity distributions. So in practice, the learned velocity distribution is not perfect because probably it's very hard to model. Therefore, instead of one-step generation of the initial distribution, we can choose to propagate the samples for a couple of steps. We typically, in experiments, use 2 to 5 steps for the data generation. So I pause here. Any question regarding this training and sampling process? Okay, so if no question, then I continue. So in this case, right, so we have this viewed like a more like stochastic process for data generation. Probably it's very hard to follow the same idea of flow matching to do the exact likelihood estimation. Because in the original formula, it uses the transport equation or the continuity equation for the ODE. Now, one observation that we have is according to the expression for the velocity distribution, we have the following equality for indicated as equation 2. So now using this, what we can see is at time is equal to 0, our likelihood or the probability for location for sample Z1 is equal to pi 1 for velocity Z1 minus Z0 at location Z0, 0, for where Z0 is drawn from a rho 0. In this case, we can directly evaluate the likelihood of the generated sample via the likelihood of the velocity Z1 minus Z0. So for time t is equal to 1, rearranging equation 2, what we observe is that log pi 1 is essentially just so the right-hand side of equation 2 becomes the log rho 1 of Z1. So it doesn't give us additional information on how to evaluate the likelihood for rho 1 Z1. So at time, we can't use t is equal to 1 to directly evaluate the likelihood for the generated sample. So for t that is between 0 and 1, we need to evaluate rho t zt in order to estimate the likelihood of the sample Z1. So we have the following procedure to generate it. So the density at time t can be computed according to the following expression. Now, in both cases, so in this slide and in the previous slide, if we want to use rho 1 is equal to pi 1 Z1 minus Z0, we always need to evaluate the likelihood for the velocity sample. So in this case, we can follow the previous rectified flow or flow matching ideas just to use the results from ordinary differential equations. We can have the following equation that we can use it to efficiently evaluate its likelihood. So the random variable ut is as a function of tau, u tau as a function of tau can be obtained by solving the ODE backward with fixed u at tau is equal to 1. Then the term gradient, the divergence term is computed by using the scaling Hutchinson trace estimator efficiently. So the vector Jacobian product can be efficiently computed by using a reverse mode auto-differentiation at approximately the same cost as evaluating the acceleration network itself. So there's a very established procedure for evaluating the velocity likelihood. So then using this, we can actually get a pretty decent estimation of the likelihood. So in this case, on the left-hand side, I show you the result if we evaluate the likelihood according to our previous formula for time is equal to 0. We compare it with the baseline rectified flow. We can see that our orange line is actually much better. So the blue line is the ground truth data likelihood. And on the right-hand side, sorry, excuse me, we show results for t is equal to 0.2, t is equal to 0.4, and t is equal to 0.6. In fact, we can also average over the time t for a estimation. So now after generating, introducing the basic idea of this hierarchical two-level flow matching, where we target at modeling the distribution of the induced velocity, then can we actually extend the training and sampling procedure to an arbitrary depth? So the idea is, instead of modeling the velocity distribution by matching accelerations, we can model the acceleration distribution by matching jerk, or go even deeper towards snap, crackle, pop, and beyond. So here we just generate this more generalized idea of going into deeper depth level D. So there's a limitation for such a model, which is like a model structure. It will increase the model to a much bigger network. But overall, I think this is a very straightforward extension to our previous approach. And here we are modeling a generalized functional field of directions. It can be velocity, it can be acceleration, it can be the crackle or jerk, any corresponding depth name. So for this formula, for D is equal to 1, this is the vanilla flow matching idea where you learn the expected velocity. And for D is equal to 2, this is what we have proposed for learning this F is equal to an acceleration. So here we are just generalize it. X0 is points drawn from a source distribution, and this is our generalized formulation. Now, for the sampling process, instead of just coupled two-layer ODEs, now we have depth of D layered ODEs to do the simulation. So this is a very straightforward generalization of the hierarchical flow matching with depth 2 to any arbitrary depth D. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So here we look at just a 1D example. On the top, A, we have the data distribution, which is a mixture of 5 Gaussians. We look at its performance for some generation using sampling steps, so from 10 to 200. The gray line is our baseline, which is the original rectified flow. On the y-axis, we use the Wasserstein distance to measure how well it fits the original distribution. And we average over a few runs. So on the shade shows the standard deviation of our evaluation. So you can see that using a hierarchical flow with 2 layers, And here 5 V steps, meaning that we do 5 steps of V integration. And our x-axis, NFE, is a total NFE, meaning it's a product of the number of steps in V and the number of steps in X. So here, the red line is the HRF with 10 V steps, and then we have HRF2 with 20 V steps. The bright red curve is the HRF3, and we can see that it actually achieves quite much better result compared to, at NFE like 200 compared with other models. So overall, in terms of the trajectories, we can see RF is this more like a very smooth curve because it's a ODE formula. And in the HRF, because of the randomness, you can see this jiggling path in the generated path. So now if we look at the 2D examples, right? So here we have shown you two examples. One is, let's say the source distribution are just a mixture, source distribution is just a single Gaussian, which is labeled in gray. And then we have the generated points as in blue. So the ground truth is just a mixture of 6 Gaussians in 2D. We can see that in the rectified flow trajectory in column B, you can see a lot of like trajectories going towards the center and then get repelled and then get to blue points. So this phenomenon is because of, we have this non-crossing path. So therefore it can get very, very curved at the center, closer to the center. Now for the HRF2, depth 2 and depth 3, we can see that we can model any like crossing, so you don't see this blank place in the middle. In terms of evaluation, we use the slice Wasserstein distance to measure how well our generated points fits with the true distribution. And we can see that we always outperform the ground truth, which is in gray. So we can also see that for the HRF3, depth 3 level in the moon data, in this particular data points example, we can see its performance is pretty good. So in terms of the model size, training, and sampling, for the 1D and 2D data, we actually use a much smaller model compared to the original rectified flow for HRF2. But HRF3, because we have those, 3 layers, it actually, the model size can get pretty big by blowing, because of the additional information to encode for the model. So in terms of the training time, we can see that our model also outperforms the original RF model. And here we show you the inference time for a total NFE budgets at 5, 10, 50, and 100. So now for more higher dimensional data, we checked like MNIST CIFAR10 and ImageNet 32 by 32. So what we can see is now the evaluation is according to the FID, fair inception distance. So the FID score, the lower is the better. So on the x-axis, we have the total number of neural function evaluations. So here we have the 10, we can see that our HRF2 at layer 2 has better performance in terms of FID compared to the original baseline. Here are the information about the model size, training, and inference time on images. So for higher dimensional data sets, we need to kind of think about more carefully about the architecture. So here in MNIST, we use a model that modifies the res block in the UNet. But for CIFAR10 and ImageNet, we use a separate UNet for the velocity and for XT. So here there are many design choices for the models. I think that one of the future works would be how can we evaluate or how can we improve the model performance by exploring more better architecture for such generative tasks. So on the inference part, we can see that our inference time is on par with the previous model. And for models that is slightly bigger, the inference time is slightly larger than the RF. So I pause here. So here is the overall hierarchical flow matching of the vanilla version without any mini batch coupling. So any questions so far for this part?
Hi.
Hey, yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm Anirudh. I'm a postdoc here at Brown. So I had a question. So for the in a very high level sense, can I think of like the hierarchical model is like when you're moving from the input to the output distribution, at every point you have like two kind of information. Apart from the velocity, you also have an acceleration information on how to move, right?
Mhm.
So does that make it more informed in going from the input to the output distribution?
So the acceleration is just used for you to draw a sample for a velocity.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't really, so it helps you to get a velocity sample, and then using that velocity sample, you can get to the data point. So that's the hierarchy. So here, what do you mean by the input and output here?
So like when you go from the source to the target distribution, right? So when in rectified flow, they
Yeah.
just use the information of the velocity, right? Here you are informing even with the acceleration, right? So something it has more kind of information when moving from the source to target, right?
The
Can I think of
information.
that, or is it
So I think the fact that the rectified flow is using the information of the mean velocity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So because in the linear interpolation, you can see that the resulting velocity at any location is actually stochastic using linear interpolation. But using the rectified flow, they were saying that you just need to learn the mean velocity because that's sufficient for learning the data distribution. You can generate that according to that trajectory. So what we are saying is instead of using the mean velocity, can we just, can draw any sample of that velocity distribution and using that stochastic sample to propagate the source distribution, right? So then the resulting path is actually a stochastic one. But it's not like using SDE because using SDE at each point, you are just, the randomness is Gaussian.
Yeah.
But here we want to really learn the multimodal velocity distribution, and then the resulting ODE or the process is more like, I think in fluid dynamics, people have proposed some models for random differential equation that your propagation of particles, it follows the random velocity distribution. So that's the main motivation for this work. And then we can see that we can use a model of course, this is more complex because your input, instead of xtt for velocity, now you have xtt, v tau, and tau. So you have additional time axis tau, and then t for the data. So of course, the model, you need to be kind of in a sense, as for a high dimensional case, we need to kind of explore the model architecture, how to efficiently compress the whole model. Otherwise, it's at least 2 times the original model, right?
Original one. Yeah.
So that's why going to the deeper level, it can be done, but in terms of the modeling itself, maybe because your input gets increased by a lot, right? You need this d dimension for each of those. You have xtt and then a tau tau and then some other formula. So that's why it can be done, but practically right now we just explored like layer 2 and 3, and we have only tried 4 and 5 for like 1D examples. So one of the future direction is to see how this can be done more efficiently and whether there are more things to like explore or to extract. So one thing, does that answer your question?
Yeah. That makes complete sense. I had a follow-up on that aspect. Like when you, so how sensitive it is to this model architecture? Like even for a lesser parameter model, do you see the similar kind of gain between them, or it has like between the RF and the HRF? Do you see the similar kind of gain even if you change your architecture a little bit?
I think one thing we note is that, interestingly, for MNIST, we tried a slightly different model than CFAR10 and 32. It actually results in a smaller model than RF because the channel size is reduced. And it was kind of also res block information, like how we incorporate XT information. Like we treat V tau as XT to the original flow matching, but then how can we input XT and T information that we did it differently? So for MNIST, we have a slightly different model architecture, and it results in a much better performance in here. But the similar architecture, we feel that it doesn't really work for CFAR10 and ImageNet. It may be because of the type of the data itself. Like in MNIST, it's very structured, and then it's black and white. And then we use similar model for CFAR10 and ImageNet because they look pretty similar. And yeah, so I can say that it is sensitive to the model architecture itself. Yeah, how to model and train it can be, but we don't have a lot of compute resource to really explore this this part. But yeah, so this is one thing that we have explored. Anything?
No, that's it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's
For more details, they are in the appendix of the paper. So
thank you. Thank you so much.
yeah. Any other questions so far? If there's no more question, I want to just high level get some talk about the mini batch coupling before the time run out. So more recently, this is actually still an ongoing work. We are looking at hierarchical rectifier flow with mini batch couplings. So this is mostly inspired by the previous work on flow matching, where people try to use multi-sample, like a mini batch optimal transport coupling to straighten the sampling path. So now, instead of straightening the path, we actually look at this from a different perspective as can we gradually simplify the complexity of the ground truth velocity distribution. So to do this, we basically incorporate the similar idea of mini batch optimal transport into two-layered hierarchical flow model. So what is the corresponding idea? So the velocity distribution would be with mini batch couplings is the following. So we are now not dealing with independent draw of x0 and x1 from source and target distribution. We look at that drawing distribution that satisfies some like marginal distributions. So we can see that basically the velocity distribution now becomes the instead of row 0, row 1, we can use this joint distribution, and it is actually very simple to prove because we know that V and xt has the joint distribution that is the product of pi1 and rho t. Now, we also observe that V and xt is just a linear transformation of x1 and x0, and the determinant of this linear matrix A is just 1. So therefore, we can now write it as, get the following relation. So the product of pi1 and rho t is essentially the gamma, the joint distribution at xt minus tv and xt plus 1 minus tv. So after rearranging, you get the formula for the velocity distribution. So now we can now do this very easily following the previous mini batch optimal transport for the data. So essentially at each training iteration, you draw a batch of B samples from X from source distribution and B from the data. Now you apply the optimal transport, it can be efficiently solved for small batch size. So using standard toolbox like POT. Now, this coupling can give you a permutation of the points. So that pairs x0 and x1. So you pair x0i with x1si. So S is the coupling that you get from this optimal transport algorithm. So then you can basically now, instead of independently drawn from the source and data distributions, now you draw x0, x1 from this pairs. So therefore, now this is for the data coupling, and we also have data and velocity couplings. That's the same idea. So basically, it eliminates the independence between V0 and V1. Now we can say that the corresponding joint distribution is this kappa, which depends on the location xtt. And we have the following training objective. So now one caveat for the velocity coupling is that obtaining velocity samples for a fixed xtt requires simulation. So we don't have the samples for V directly because we don't have like so many data points that all the everything cross at xtt perfectly. So therefore, we use a pre-trained model to simulate the sample V. And then after doing the sampling, we can now do mini batch optimal transport or even reflow to couple those samples to get this joint distribution kappa. So what is the effect? So this is the slide that I really want to illustrate. So for the figure A, we have the original velocity distribution. Let's say here, source distribution is still a Gaussian, and then the target distribution is a mixture of two Gaussians. So in this case, we don't have the ground truth velocity distribution. So here we just use the different number of V integration steps to show you the effect. So at 100 V integration steps, we get this mixture of two Gaussians. Now, if we do the data coupling and in figure B with batch size 5, we can see the effect that it changes the velocity distribution to kind of a one big mode at around 0, and then a small mode at around like 2, right? If you increase the batch size by 100, so this is the data batch OT size is 100, we can see that at 100 step V integration steps, you basically get something looks like a unimodal Gaussian around location velocity 0. Right, so basically the mode at 2 just disappear, and then you get a more unimodal distribution. So in this sense, the data coupling with larger batch size can give you simplify the velocity distribution greatly. So in the limit, if you can fully solve the optimal transport, basically you should get a delta distribution, right? So so that's the illustration of the effect of the data coupling. Now, in addition, if we can do the velocity coupling, we can see that without data coupling, you don't simplify the velocity distribution. Instead, velocity distribution simplifies the acceleration distribution that you want to model. And then according to the data coupling with data batch size 5, you can see that it models similar distribution as figure B, but you requires less number of velocity integration steps. So similarly for equation for figure F, you can see that you get this unimodal at velocity 0, but you require less number, maybe 20 V integration steps is sufficient. So this is the idea of gradually simplifying the velocity, the distribution that you want to learn. So I think I probably stop here to just illustrate some ideas. Now, in summary, what we have shown is in this talk we study a hierarchical flow matching to capture the multimodal velocity distribution for data generation. We have some ideas of using mini batch OT coupling for data to simplify the velocity distribution and using velocity coupling to simplify the acceleration distributions. Now, there are many open problems. One, as we discussed, the architecture of the network, how to utilize multiple informations efficiently. Then also we can improve the likelihood estimation. Now, there are more mathematical questions about, what's the generalization property? Do we need more samples than the original flow matching? Or can we use it, can we do it because we simplify maybe velocity distribution or that other things, can we use less data to model to have better generative models? And in the future, we are also interested in solving imaging inverse problems, probabilistic forecasting for dynamical systems using the generative models. And so for the reference, we have this project webpage. You can take a look. And on that, we have a dynamic illustration of the path we learn. And we can see that we basically can mix the blue and red points using our hierarchical rectified flow that is similar to the original linear interpolation. So that said, hold on. I would like to thank my collaborators, so my students Yichi and Yici, and then my collaborator Alex. And I also want to acknowledge the funding agencies, NSF and Sloan Foundation. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your great talk. So, do we have any other questions for the speaker? Yes, Vivek.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. My name is Vivek and I'm a PhD student working with Professor Karnidakis. So I had a question about, so you showed the generation of 1D or 2D cases where you're trying to generate functions of two coordinates, like two coordinates in space. How difficult is it to extend this to generation of volumetric fields, like function of X, Y, and Z? For example, images is a function of X and Y. How difficult is it to extend it to generation of functions of space, like velocity field in space or a stress field in stress tensor in space? So, what is your comment on that? Thank you.
Can you vectorize it to high dimensional data, or do you want to preserve the?
You can vectorize it to high dimensional data. It's, for example, if your image is 64 square, instead be like a 128 cube, for example, or so it is a vectorized representation of a volumetric field. So how difficult, like how much do you need to change the solver, like the
One thing I know is generally for not restricted to this, for like diffusion model and flow metric models, you want to have volumetric data, which you probably need some kind of very good latent space parameterization. Otherwise, it's going to be very time consuming, like memory wise. So one thing is, can you have a model that like basically reduce the dimension? So even here in the 2D image, let's say people use stable diffusion, what they do is, so for an image of size 256 by 256, they lower, they do the pre-trained autoencoder to get to say dimension of 4 times 32 by 32. So they have the latent embedding, and then in the latent embedding, they do this diffusion or flow matching or other work, because directly training that high dimensional stuff is going to be
right. But there also in the latent embedding, it is still different channels of reduced dimensional 2D images, right? 4 channels of 2D images. But my
yeah, you
question,
can also increase it to tensors. It doesn't matter. The other thing people have tried is to use NeRF. Like
yes,
they train the NeRF and then they do another diffusion model on top of the NeRF, and
right.
then they do something else. But
Auto decoding, yeah, right, yeah.
yeah, so that's more like using NeRF to characterize the functional, right? So I personally haven't tried that, so I don't know how difficult or compute expensive that. Yeah.
Thank
But
you.
there are, I mean, there are other ways, and also you can think about a nice decomposition of the field to explore the structure in your field, and then use that in the other space to work with generative models, because I do think just directly applying it doesn't probably is too compute extensive.
Right. I had tried using diffusion models directly on volumetric data. Like I was able to manage the computational cost, but still the generated samples were very, very noisy. That is why I was asking if the normalizing flows or the hierarchical flows that you proposed could somehow offer a solution.
Right now we are still at an earlier stage. As I mentioned, the architecture would probably be quite expensive, but I
Right.
would be but I think probably one useful way is finding a good latent space for it. That probably would be one thing to try. Other things, which version of the diffusion model have you tried?
EDM, Elucidating Design Space of Diffusion Models by Tero Karas from 2023. It takes like 32 function evaluations for CIFAR 10 and MNIST, in the order of 30s, like close to 30s. So it's a modern architecture, but yes.
I know there are other works in the volumetric CT scan. They do some kind of, they draw, because in traditionally like trained image, right, you have 3 channels, RBG channels. What they
Yes.
do is they randomly sample 3 slices of the volume and then fake it as the
2D.
RGB image. And then they add another position encoding for the random draw of the 3 slices in the volume.
Understood. That's interesting. Yeah.
So and then merge them together. Then they can use a pre-trained model very easily.
That's cool.
But I don't know how, like, similar your data with the medical CT scans. Like, I think at least they show this works for the CT scans. But you
For the
also,
CT scans, I often seen they use the DDPM, which still takes like 1,000 function evaluations. But I couldn't see anyone who you could bring it down to like 30s. So that is the issue.
Depends on the, you want to do any solving inverse problems or, there are some works, but it depends on the applications.
Thank you.
How much like accurate do you want to, how accurate you want to be.
Thank you for the answer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? We can take one more question, probably. No. Thank you so much for your great talk and joining us today. So I think it's time to move to our second session. Our second speaker is Professor Zhuo-Cheng. He will be giving a talk on From Spiking Networks to Differential Equations, a model reduction framework for neurodynamics. Zhao-Cheng Xiao is an assistant professor in mathematics and neuroscience at NYU Shanghai. Prior to joining NYU Shanghai, he was a Schwartz Fellow at New York University and a current instructor at the Curran Institute of Mathematical Science, New York University, from 2021 to 2023. He earned dual bachelor's degree in biology and mathematics from Peking University in 2016 and completed his PhD in applied mathematics at the University of Arizona in 2020. Zhao-Cheng's research breeds mathematics and neuroscience. His work focuses on developing multi-scale models of the cortex and model reduction methods for spiking neuronal networks. In addition, he also works on deep spiking networks. With that short introduction, the floor is yours and you can start your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So I just have a quick question for you. So how much time do I really have? Like 15 minutes?
Even more, because you are the second speaker, so you have time.
Okay. Thank you very much. So thank you, Nats, and it has been an honor to be invited to present our work in this seminar. So so as you can see that this talk and most of my work is about developing better applied mathematical methods for modeling questions in neuroscience. So inevitably, we need some introductions, to neuroscience. About neuroscience, but I promise to keep it within one slide. Okay, so I think the most relevant point over here is that the cortex is naturally a multi-scale dynamical system. Okay, so for example, human cortex, it contains like 16 billion of neurons and around 60 trillions of synapses. Of course, it's very large and it's perhaps one of the most complicated living dynamical system that we know. And but the interesting thing is that the cortex actually contains a lot of different details on different levels of scales. So for example, on the larger scale, the cortex can be divided into many different areas depending on the corresponding, for example, brain functions. And let me give you one example. So the primary visual cortex over here, which is on the back side of the brain, right? So this is the first cortical area that processes the visual information and one of the most experimentally studied areas. And you also have other types of the cortical areas on different parts of the brains. But if you go, let's say, if you're focusing on one brain area, okay, and if you go one layer, if you go one step further, then basically what you can see is that the anatomical structures of the of cortex, of course, cortex is highly compacted, okay, in your skull. But if you imagine that, if you try to unenroll that, okay, and put everything on a 2D plane, then the cortex itself can be reasonably viewed as a second 2D plane, and it roughly contains about 6 layers, okay, on the horizontal level, right? And also on the cortical levels. Well, these 6 layers, they have, of course, each layer have their different anatomy. It contains different types of neurons and has some different architectures. And on the vertical level, the most prominent brain architecture is perhaps the so-called functional columns. And in these each of the function columns they may have similar. If we are constraining ourselves with seeing one brain area and one layer, then these functional columns, they may have similar local architectures. Okay, we call them like as the local circuits. And of course, if you go even one more step further, then of course all these local circuits are they are made up by neurons, right? Okay, and each neurons are talking to each other via spikes. So this is again going back to the point I would like to sell over here, that the cortex is indeed a multi-scale system. So the very natural working flow which is developed, okay, following this idea is that a multi-scale modeling framework for the brain. And under this working topic, I have primarily 2 different parts of work. The first part is about how do you compute faster when you're trying to modeling the brain. Okay, so this is about a multi-scale method which is developed collaboratively with Professor Lyson Yang and Professor Kevin Lane at New York University and University of Arizona. Okay, but the focus for today is about mathematical theories, okay, for local neural circuits. So we have been developed several techniques, several pipelines of work over here, and but the most important part that I would like to focus on today is about one of our recent work, which is about discrete state ordinary differential equations, and it focuses on reducing the spiking neural networks to a group of Markov models, and then to a group of ordinary differential equations. And in this process, we are trying to minimize the assumptions that we make, so to make sure that we are losing the minimal amount of details. Okay, and what we're going to find is that this type of discrete state of ordinary differential equations can successfully predict the detailed temporal dynamics produced by local cortical circuits. Okay, so this is the joint work with Zhuo-Cheng, Zhuoran Li, Zhongyi Wang, and Professor Louis Tao, which is my collaborator at Peking University. So this and one more comment about this is that the mathematical theories for the local neural circuits, they are by nature the natural building blocks, okay, when you are trying to develop more efficient and accurate model on the large scale for cortex. Okay, so let's start from the bottom level. The first thing I would like to say, I would like to introduce over here is about single neurons. Okay, so of course, on the bottom level of the brain, the single neurons, they communicate with each other via electronic spikes. Okay, so each neurons are keep producing spikes, and these signals are received by the other neurons. The other neurons integrate these spikes, and then they also produce their own spikes, and then pass on to other neurons. Okay, and the neurons can be categorized, okay, basically into 2 groups by the nature of the spike that they produce, okay? So one group is called excitatory neurons, and the other group is called inhibitory neurons. The excitatory neurons, they produce excitatory spikes, which means that when the other neurons receive the spikes produced by the excitatory neurons, the postsynaptic neurons will be excited, okay? Their memory potential will increase, and which is easier for the postsynaptic neurons to produce spikes. And the inhibitory neurons do exactly the opposite things, which means that they produce inhibitory spikes, and when received by the other neurons, these neurons will be harder to produce the spikes, okay? So there have been a lot of mathematical models for single neurons, okay, starting from the Nobel Prize winning work, starting from the Hodgkin-Huxley model, okay, which was very detailed, describing the detailed level of physiology for single neurons. And what we are focusing on today is one class that's called one class of model that's widely used in both neuroscience and also machine learning, which is called the integrated fire model. So under the description of the integrated fire model, what you can see is that we mostly care about one thing, one condition about single neuron, which is voltage or membrane potential. And voltage is of a neuron is driven by the current, okay, received, okay, by this neuron. So over here, you can see that in the integrated fire model, it is the currents received by single neuron is decomposed into four parts. Besides the leaky currents, what you can also see is that, okay, what about the external input, the external currents? What about the recurrent excitatory currents, okay, received, which means that they integrate the excitatory spikes, okay, from the other neurons, or they're integrating the spikes from other inhibitory neurons. And one of the most important feature about the integrated fire model over here is that, okay, what you can see is that, okay, so when integrating these current input from other neurons, if, for example, the memory potential may first go up, right? But after it reaches a threshold, then a spike is released from this neuron, okay? And then the memory potential will jump back, okay, or reset to the rest potential. And after that, a new cycle begins, and when it reaches the threshold, it goes down again and again and again and again. Okay, and this timing for the threshold crossing is exactly the timing for this neuron to produce spike. Okay, and this is the again the idea of the integrated fire models for single neurons. And if you extend that, okay, let's say if you're having many spiking neurons and you're trying to wire them together, then you obtain a spiking neural network. So for example, we are having a few neurons over here, and the red neurons, they are excitatory, the blue neurons, they are inhibitory. Then what you can see is that the spiking information are exactly integrated, okay, into the conductance terms, which is the G over here, right? Because so let's say if we're focusing on one neuron, I over here, then there will be then we can focus on two time series. The first time series is the TEI, which summarizes all the spikes received by neuron I produced by other E neurons, and TII summarize all the spikes received by I neurons produced by other I neurons. Okay, and so these are reflected in the excitatory conductances and the inhibitory conductances, okay, of the corresponding I neuron. Okay, so so this is a showcase for examples about the possible network dynamics produced by integrated fire spiking networks. So this is an example. So this is the examples of so-called raster plots. So how do you read this type of graphs? Well, the x-axis is the timing, okay, and the y-axis is the neuron index. So the neuron index labels the different neurons within the same network. Okay, so if you're finding a dot over here, okay, for example, for neuron number 100, okay, and at certain timing, that means that at this time, okay, the neuron number 100 exactly releases a spike. So the raster plot conveys the spiking pattern produced by the integrated fire network, which is also the most important signature, okay, of the corresponding dynamics. So this is the so these are some examples for the raster plots or for the network dynamics produced by the by a single excitatory population. But when a single excitatory population is wired with another single inhibitory population, then very interesting things can happen. So this is another example, which means that over here that you can see actually when I'm only tuning one parameter, okay, then this connected excitatory and inhibitory populations, they can produce very interesting dynamics over here, which is the so-called partial synchrony. That you can see that okay over here that the network dynamics is actually very synchronous, and the majority of the neurons, they are producing their spikes okay within a very short time intervals, and these patterns persist okay in this network. But when you are varying slowly the corresponding parameters, you're going to see that okay, so these you're going to see that these spiking patterns are actually becoming less synchronized and almost temporally homogeneous. And again, all of this can be done okay when you are only varying one parameter. So if we want to seek an idealistic mathematical theory okay for spiking neural networks, I would call that a mapping. Okay, so the question is that why do we need mathematical theories for local neural circuits? Well, my answer is the following. So you see, for a local neural circuit, it receives the input from, for example, other local neural circuits in the brain, and it also receives input from external sources, for example, the feedforward, the feedback, the regulatory inputs from the other part of the brain, and the output is exactly the responses, okay, or the dynamics or the firing patterns given rise by these local circuits. Okay, so this can be reasonably viewed as a very high-dimensional input-output relation. If you call this as a local response function, then phi, then this is a phi integrating the inputs from many different sources and give rise to the corresponding output R, right? So we would like to understand, for example, how do single-cell physiology give rise to different type of dynamics of the network, and or for example, how do different network architecture give rise to the different types of computation power for the corresponding local neural circuits. And of course, if I understand the local neural circuits better, then I will have a better building blocks for the multi-scale models, right? Then again, a unified theory for the spiking neural network, if that exists, would be something the following. So again, that theory is a mapping, and that mapping works as that. Okay, if I have the corresponding parameters, and if I have the corresponding neural network architecture, and if I have the corresponding inputs from the external world, then without really simulating the corresponding spiking neural network, I can directly tell you I can directly predict what are the dynamics, what are the dynamic statistics, and what are the corresponding brain functions produced by the spiking neural networks. And alas, well, such thing doesn't exist yet. Such an ideal mapping or ideal mathematical theory doesn't exist yet. Well, the main issues are the following. The first thing is that people have already found that okay, the different parameters and the network architectures of spiking neural networks can easily give rise to very rich types of network dynamics. Okay, and on the other hand, due to the limitation of the experimental techniques of human, okay, so actually these parameters and architectures in the brain, they are usually not so well constrained by the neuroscience experiments, which means that a generic theory, mathematical theory, cannot presume the type of dynamics and parameters that we are going to face. Okay, then why that is a big problem? Well, okay, so here are the biggest challenges. The first challenge is that, okay, for a local neural circuits, actually we are dealing with finite number of neurons. So this is actually a estimated number of neurons per columns, okay, in mouse, which you can see the corresponding number of neurons in the column, okay, for mouses is actually in around, let's say, a few dozens to a few thousands. So which means that the n, the number of neurons, okay, in the local neural circuits, that is definitely not small. So we don't have the luxury for a low dimensional dynamic system. But on the other hand, the n doesn't go to infinity either. Okay, the dimensionality is for the system is usually O(n). Okay, and which means that here the contribution for single neurons and single spikes are not negligible. Why that is important? Because you see, if n was large in the system, and if we have, one might be able to employ the tools from the statistical mechanics, right? And under which assumptions the single spikes and single neurons, they never matters anymore, but only their collective behaviors. For example, the rates of the spiking events and the variabilities of single neurons will simply average out. Okay, that is the issue that was brought up by the finite number of neurons. And the second mathematical challenge is exactly the existence of spike. Okay, the very nature of the spiking neural network. Why is that? The most prominent issue is that the spike, the dynamics producing spikes is actually irreversible, which means that, again, going back to the mechanism producing spike, you can see that a neuron can fire, right, and then go to the refractive, and then maybe, for example, go to the refractive period and then the reset, but this can never go backwards, which means that, well, the topology, the underlying topology for the integrand and phi neural network is something like, for the integrand and phi single neuron is something like the following. So, okay, so which means that, okay, when driven by acceleratory currents, it may go like this, right? And all the way go into the firing threshold and then reset to 0. But this step cannot go on the other direction, which means that if I am here, okay, if I'm here around the refractive period or around the reset, around the rest potential, there's no way for me to directly go back, going backwards, crossing the membrane potential and going back to somewhere that's very close to the threshold, right? Okay, so this is unlike most of the Newtonian mechanics, okay, that you can see in the physical world. So which means that this is very challenging for the methods, or for any model reduction methods or modeling methods based on differential equations. Okay, and there have been many previous attempts and efforts, okay, to building up the mathematical theories. And here I'm just going to instead of just pronouncing all of the words, okay, I will be very generally talking about the gains and the losses. Okay, so these previous mathematical theories, they're usually based on many extra assumptions. For example, one may assume that, okay, the coupling, okay, between the neurons or the synapses, they are weak, or they are very sparse, or the number of neurons, they goes to infinity. By doing that, one might be able to, again, as I said, average out the spikes and the effect brought by single neurons and single spikes. Okay, and one may also assume that the dynamics produced by the spiking neural networks exhibit only very weak or even no synchrony. And by doing that, one might be able to do some very elegant mean field analysis, or work on even more simplified single neurons. But you see, there's no free lunch, right? By making those assumptions, actually, for example, if you assume that n goes to infinity, then what about the finite number of fluctuations and cortical variability that people usually see within one cortical column, right? If we simply ignore the synchrony, then what about the transient synchrony that people observe a lot in populations, that people observe a lot in the neuroscience experiments, which takes place within on time scales within 1 to 100 milliseconds, right? And if we simplify the single neuron models, then how do people understand how do the macro dynamics and the macro brain functions depends on the micro biological details, such as the ion channels, right? So all these are unresolved questions. So our attempt to address these questions are exactly the work that we'd like to present today, which is the discrete state ordinary differential equations, we'll be coming with the minimized assumption. Okay, and this framework, as I'm going to present, this framework is going to be very flexible for many applications between different levels of temporal synchrony, and also about the neural oscillations on multiple frequency bands, and also about the metastable dynamics that can possibly be produced by spiky neural networks, which is and such phenomena is observed a lot when humans are doing, for example, decision-making process or planning processes. Okay. Okay, so this is going to be a very high-level introductions, okay, about the mathematical framework for the discrete state ordinary differential equation. We'll be starting from the integral and phi equation that we introduced, but I would like to also make a very quick comment that this framework has the potential to be extended to much more biologically realistic neurons, such as Hodgkin-Huxley. Okay, and we're aiming for producing a set of ordinary differential equations at last, because again, simply because ODEs, they have great analyzability and tractabilities. Okay, so the biggest idea over here is to discretize the state of single neurons. As you can see that originally for a integrand phi neuron, right, the possible state of an integrand phi neuron is actually continuous. Over here, ranging continuously from 0 to 1, and also may include the refractory state, right? So the first idea of the discrete state ODE is that we discretize these states. Okay, so now I'm having, for example, discretized 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and after that, of course, for the whole population, some of the neurons fall in the first state and the second state, and then the third state, fourth state, fifth state, right? So after that, I do some cost screening. I'm going to make some very minimal assumptions to make sure that all these neurons in the same state, they are interchangeable. So by doing that, I only need to count the number of neurons in each state, count the number of neurons in each state instead of tracing the detailed dynamics of every single neurons anymore. So this is actually very good for homogeneous network architecture. For example, when all these neurons within the same populations, they are, for example, randomly connected, okay, or all connected, or sparsely connected, or let's say as long as all the connections are following exactly the same rules. So the first step is that, okay, so after you have done the discretization of the state of the neuron, well, you are able to rewrite the originally integrand phi dynamics of single neuron into a Markov chain. Okay, so again, for the integrand phi neuron, you see the membrane potential are driven by the currents, right? And in the same Markov chain, okay, we're using the Markov chain to resemble the dynamics for the single neuron. So now the membrane potential is again now driven by all these input. But now all the dynamics are becoming jumps, okay? Jumps for the single neuron from one state to the other. And these jumping rates are exactly copying, okay, the corresponding terms, okay? Copying the corresponding terms from the linear integral phi equations. So again, this is a comparison between the two different types of the framework. In the integral, this is again an example of traces, okay, for the integrand phi equation. And this is its Markovian surrogate, which you can see is that, okay, again, these are jumps and jumps and jumps. But the most important thing is that now the reset, okay, from the threshold to the rest potential, okay, the reset step, which was discrete and singular in the original integrand phi equation, now it just simply become a very regular jump from one state to the other, right? Because now all these transitions are becoming jumps. So our claim is that, okay, our claim is that the Markovian model for the single neuron, okay, will converge back to the traces, okay, for the integrated phi neurons, okay, when the number of discretized states goes to infinity. Okay, but again, so far we only have numerical evidence. We don't have any rigorous proof for this, and presumably this is actually going to be easy for single neurons, but it's going to be much harder. Okay, for when you're extending that to a spiking neural network. So we don't know yet. We don't know. Okay, if this convergence is taking place weakly or strongly or at which rate, and this is actually one of our future working directions. And after that, if you are having a Markov model for single neurons, then we can extend that from the single neuron to a network. And the only assumption that we are having over here is that all the current drives for single neurons quickly decorrelates from its own history. And when will this be true? Well, this will be true if this amount is small. Okay, which means that this assumption will be wrong. Okay, if we are having very long characteristic time scale for the currents, or if we are having very small number of neurons in all. Okay, or if the it wasn't. It should not be or, but it should be and. Okay, and if the firing rate for the corresponding network is very, very low, we need all these bad things to take place simultaneously. Okay, to make sure that this assumption is wrong, and otherwise this assumption usually holds for a homogeneous network. And again, the effect is that the neuron IJ are indistinguishable as long as they are occupying the same state, okay, in the discretized Markovian framework. And therefore, the coarse-grained Markovian spiking network, okay, it cares about the number of neurons in each state and a general current drive which means that we are using exactly the same we're using exactly the same probability distribution, okay, to describe the current input for the different neurons in the single population. Okay. And and the next step is to again recontinuize the discrete Markovian spiking network by a Gaussian assumption by first using a Gaussian assumption to describe the current input, and then very naturally the number of neurons in each state, okay, can be very naturally described by a set of ordinary differential equations. This set of ODE simply counts the number of neurons going out, okay, and the number of neurons going in, okay, for the corresponding state. So it is an ODE if we are ignoring all these noises, okay, due to the finite number of neurons, okay. But that noise can be very easily recovered if we are using a stochastic differential equation instead of ordinary differential equations, okay? And I would like to mention real quick that this framework is likely to fall, okay? It's likely to fail, okay, when the number of neurons in each state is very, very small. So this is going to be a competition between the number of states versus the number of neurons. Okay, and if we are having smaller number of neurons, that usually requires us to have smaller number of states to accommodate the Gaussian assumptions that we make for the currents. Okay, so so this is the overview for the DSODE framework. So we are reducing the leaking integral phi neural network, okay, which contains in which the number of variables is determined by the number of neurons, okay, to a set of ordinary differential equations in which the dimensionality only depends on, okay, the number of states instead of the number of neurons that we and we are controlling the number of states because that's something that we defines, right? Okay. And what do we lose? Well, in this process, our losses are exactly, first of all, the network architecture, because again, we only assumed homogeneous network architecture. And we are also losing the detailed traces of single neurons because again, this is because we are doing the coarse graining and this is the necessary losses. But again, what are our gains? Our gain is that the first gain is that, okay, we have been minimizing our assumption, right? We are only having the fast self-decorrelation assumption for the currents. Okay, instead of all these large assumptions that have been posed by previous mathematical theories. So this is very natural for a finite number of neurons because again we are exactly counting the number of neurons in each state. And this is also very natural to deal with the irreversibility okay, of spiking and reset, because again, now the reset process is now simply becomes the fluxes of the neurons between the states. And okay, so I have to jump the rest of this page. And the takeaway over here is that okay, the DSODE the biggest idea of the DSODE is that it discretizes the possible states of the single neurons, and by doing the cost screening, we are making the neurons okay. We are making the neurons in the same state interchangeable. Therefore, we only need to consider the number of neurons in each state, and all these current inputs for neurons are lumped together. So we only have to trace the by applying the Gaussian assumption to the corresponding currents, we only need to trace the mean and the variance of the corresponding currents. And when we are producing the DSODEs, the dimensionality only depends on the number of states of the populations instead of the number of neurons. Okay, and in practice, we find that the number of states, if we are choosing number of states becoming 10 and 20, that's actually usually good enough for any neural network, okay, with the number of neurons that's larger than 100. And because the larger number of neurons within the same network makes the behavior of the spiking neural network closer to its statistical limit, then the larger of the neurons, then actually the larger the behavior, the better the behavior of the corresponding DSODE. So yeah, so far I would like to pause this for a little bit, and I wonder if we have any questions so far.
Hi, this is Kyle from Brown. I have a very quick question. So
Yes.
what kind of states are included in the state space? How do you choose what are actually in the state space? Sorry, I'm just a little bit confused on the neuroscience concept.
Yeah, very nice. So that's actually a very good question over here. So again, over here, because again, so this question, the answer to this question actually, it naturally depends on what the single neuron model that you're dealing with. So for example, when we are dealing with the integrated fire neuron, right? So it's a very natural, it's actually a very simplified model to describe single neurons. And for this simplified model, actually, where each neuron is only determined by one variable, okay, which is memory potential. So here we're only discretizing the memory potential, which is only on 1D, right? So you only need a 1D grid. But okay, you very naturally, if you're focusing on, for example, neuron compartment models, which means that if the neuron is not a single node, but let's say it has structures, for example, the dendrite tree, right? Then you'll be needing more numbers of the phase space will be higher dimensionality, right? And you will be needing more number of states to describe that. But the good thing is that under the Markovian framework, the good thing is that you can always focus on the most relevant states and ignore the others, right? So that's potentially not a very huge problem, even if the let's say even if we are having 4 or 5 variables to describe one neuron, that's still okay. I mean, this is in our ongoing work, but I don't have more results to show over here. We'll be focusing on the integrated fire neurons, okay, in this talk. Good.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you so much.
Sure. Any other questions? No? Okay, so okay,
yeah,
good.
Actually, if I can ask a question. Hi, I'm Sasha from postdoc at Brown. So I understand let me turn on the camera.
Yes.
I understand there one important feature here is that the neurons, they decorrelate somewhat fast in time, right?
Right.
What I did not quite understand is the correlation in space.
Oh, the correlation space. That's
is that modeled? Is that considered?
That's a very, very good question. So you know what? So let me so this actually does not belong to my plan for this talk, but let me show you this framework. Okay, because this actually this actually has something to do with the multi-scale strategy itself. So imagine that you are really modeling, let's say, one layer, okay, one layer of in one brain area. So you will be naturally dealing with a 2D network. So by doing that, you're having a spatial structure, right? But the multi-scale strategy is doing what? It's actually dividing that 2D layer into many, many small pixels. And our target is actually these small pixels over here. And within one small pixels, so although that on this 2D layer, of course, there are spatial structures, okay, from pixels to pixels, but within one single pixels, because it is too small, and it only contains about, let's say, from hundreds to thousands, or even, let's say, tens of thousands of neurons, it's actually very it's natural to assume that the network architecture is homogeneous over here. We don't have a very pronounced spatial architecture within the population that we are considering over here. But again, if you're considering the larger scale, you have to deal with the spatial correlation, but not only the temporal correlation. So this is the answer to your question. Okay.
So it's kind of a Markovian type assumption, right? That only
exactly.
the nearest neighbors or next nearest neighbors are synchronizing.
Right.
Okay,
exactly.
thanks.
Okay. So yeah. So now it's time to proceed to. So this has been the introduction to the theory and how we are building up this model, right? Okay. So now, but how do that exactly works? When in the real life examples. So let's first try to apply our theory, our mathematical theory, to, let's say, the simplest possible. This is the simplest possible scenario ever, which means that we are only having one single excitatory population with only, let's say, 300 excitatory neurons. And so these are the cases. Okay, these are the raster plots and the corresponding showing the corresponding spiking patterns. Okay, and the first case is that what if there is no synaptic coupling between the neurons at all? Okay, which means that all these neurons are completely irrelevant to each other, right? Or they are lightly recurrent, or they are heavily recurrent, or they are heavily recurrent with more external noises. As you can see that the single neuron, because due to the assumption of the homogeneous network architecture, the single E population is actually not producing very rich dynamics on the long run, although the initial phase, okay, is indeed different, because you see, when you're having the more heavily recurrently connected E population, right, you can see that, okay, you can see that these spiking patterns are much more synchronized. So how do DSOD deal with that? Well, as you can see that the red curve over here is the numerical simulation for integrating fire, and the blue curve over here is our prediction from the DSOD. What you can see is that it works pretty well, right? It's a very well focused predicting, okay, at least the first of all the initial behavior, and also the behavior on the long run. Okay, no matter how you are playing with the parameters over here. Okay, but you see, the real challenge for DSOD is actually the recurrent excitatory and inhibitory network. And the most important reasons over here is that the level of synchronicity can vary a lot for a recurrent EI network. Okay, and very importantly, this is actually the mechanism behind the neural oscillations in the brain. Okay, so what you can see is that by only tuning one or two parameters, it's actually very easy to produce the different type of firing patterns. Okay, ranging from forming a continuous spectrum. Okay, ranging from completely temporal homogeneity to completely temporal synchrony. Right, and the main challenge over here is that everything is taking place within a very short time scale. So, for example, let's say initially every neuron remains silent, right? And in a chain reaction, let's say one E neuron, due to external drives or due to some random events, one excitatory neuron fires, and because that is excitatory, right? So it might be able to recruit the firing events from more excitatory neurons, and even a lot of more excitatory neurons. So this is again become a chain reaction. But this is not the complete story, because at the same time, the inhibitory neurons will also be excited by these excitatory spikes. So a few inhibitory cells will fire, and a lot more inhibitory neuron will fire when more excitatory neuron fire. So these two things are taking place simultaneously. But also, one thing to mind that in the brain, what you usually see is that the most prominent excitatory current timescale is actually shorter than the inhibitory timescale. So the effect, so the effect brought up by the excitations are usually faster than the effect brought up by the inhibition. So, which means that, so this chain reaction will go for some time and then completely shut down, because that's when the inhibitory neurons, plays the main role. So because all of these things can take place within, let's say, a few milliseconds. So this type of synchronicity or the chain reaction is actually very hard for any mean field theory to capture in a very short time scale. So this also can be saying, I'm showing the same pictures again at the very beginning, right? When you are only tuning one parameter, which is the characteristic time scale for the synaptic currents for excitatory neurons, right? When this time scale is much shorter than the inhibitory time scale, what you can see is that everything is actually very synchronized. But when this time scale becomes larger and larger, and when it's getting close to the inhibitor time scale over here, you can see that the spiking patterns becomes much more temporally homogeneous. Okay, so can our DSODE capture that? Well, the answer is yes. So this is the prediction. Again, the red curve is the simulations for the integrated fire spiking neural network, and the blue curve is our prediction from the DSODE. It not only very accurately predict the dynamics at the first, let's say, 1 or 2 hundredths of milliseconds, but the most interesting thing is that it actually captures the long-term behavior of the spiking neural network, or in other words, it accurately predict the predict the attractor produced by the different types of the spiking neural networks. So this is the first example, right? When you are having tau e, or the time scale for excitatory currents to be very small, then you are seeing these very synchronized spiking events. So you are expecting a very large a very large limit cycles in the phase plane. And what you can see is that our blue curve, which is our prediction, is actually very closely following the behavior, the numerical simulations from the integrated fire equations networks. And when we are changing this parameter, we are having the smaller limit cycle, and this is also accurately predicted by the DSODE, and even smaller limit cycles. The most interesting thing is that when tau e is actually equals to tau I over here, actually what you can see is that the DSOD is predicting not a limit cycle anymore, but only a steady state over here. But this actually seems to be deviating from the numerical results for the leaky integrated fire equation. But if we are putting the noise back to the DSODE, actually what you can see is that the central behavior is actually quite similar to the leaky integrated fire model. Okay, and this is another example when you are varying another parameter. For example, this is the synaptic coupling weights from inhibitory neurons to excitatory neurons. When that is very small, what you're going to see is that so all these spiking patterns are actually coming in one beat, which is boom, 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 this kind of things, right? And when you are increasing that, for example, to 2.95 over here, what you observe is that now the spiking behavior becomes actually becoming 2-beat, which is weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong, weak, strong on time, right? And in between, that's actually a transient state, okay, between the 1-bit and the 2-bit behaviors. And there's actually one more interesting phenomena, which is that when you are largely increase this SEI, okay, to be a very large number, then what you see is that instead of these 1-bit or 2-bit thing, actually you actually see a bistable phenomena, which is that in a longer, okay, so which is that the network may in a long time exhibit a very homogeneous, okay, temporal dynamics, but from time to time it may transition from this homogeneity to the temporal synchrony and then going back and forth, right? So again, can our DSOD predict that? The answer is again yes. Okay, so this is again for the small SEI. We're only seeing one limit cycle over here, but when we are having larger SEI, when we are having the 2-bit phenomena, you can see that instead of one cycle, we're actually having this double cycle as the limit cycle over here, and when we are further increasing the SEI, the smaller cycle, okay, in this double cycle, it actually becomes smaller, and finally, okay, this smaller cycle actually it degenerates, okay, to another stable point in the middle, and this exactly explains the bistable dynamics when you are having a high SEI, because you see in the ODE system, okay, these two states, the stable state and the limit cycle, they are completely separate, but combining with the noise, the dynamics become capable of jumping between these two different states, right? Okay, and the corresponding bifurcation diagram is also very accurately predicted, okay, by the corresponding DSODE, as you can see as the comparison. Okay, we are seeing actually very accurate prediction of the bifurcation point and bifurcation structure. Okay, and this is of course not constrained within one type of the parameters, but with much more types of the parameters, right? Okay, the bifurcation diagrams. Okay, and this is an ultimate challenge, okay, to DSODE, which is about the metastable circuits, okay, which means that over here that you are having, let's imagine that we are having two excitatory populations that are attached to one inhibitory populations simultaneously. But these two E populations are not wired to each other, so they don't have the direct crosstalks between each other, okay? Then what you usually see is that you can see that, well, from the simulations of the integrated amplifier, you may see that, okay, so either one excitatory population dominates all the time, or the dynamics may alternate from one excitatory E population to the other, right? They come alternatively on time. So the red raster represents the first E population, and the purple raster represents the other E population, right? You can see that these things are alternating on time, or two things are coexisting, okay? Or let's say we are still seeing this type of alternations, but one of the population is dominating in most of the time, and the other population is dominating in the lesser time, right? So first of all, of course, this type of dynamics is also very accurately predicted, okay, by DSODE. But the more interesting thing is that you can see that again, the geometry of the attractors in the spiking network is also very accurately captured by the DSODE. So you can see that this is one population dominating. So we are only seeing this one cycle, okay, which is muchly biased towards, okay, the muchly biased towards one of the population, and this butterfly, okay, represents the alternation. Okay, and actually the equivalent alternation between these two E populations, and here the stable point over here represents the coexistence, okay, of the two E populations together. And a very very interesting phenomena is that when you are having a biased, okay, population. And you can see that we're also having the same architecture over here. And one thing that worth noting that if we are only looking at the red point, which is the liquid integral fire simulations, it's actually very hard to understand what is going on over here, right? But with the DSODE, you can really observe that okay, all these things because because of that they are taking place because of a spiral. Okay, a saddle spiral over here. Okay, so which means that the trajectory are circling in. Okay, very slowly, but okay, when approaching the saddle, it will goes back. Okay, and goes back and will lose the stability and goes back to the dominance of the other population. Okay, and since we don't have a lot of time over here, I'm going to jump through the last few slides, which is that our DSOD is also very good at capturing the finite number of the finite neuron effect. Okay, so as you can see that the DSODE model with the noise is actually very good at capturing the deviation of the small number of the behavior of small number of neurons. Okay, when from the statistical limit. Okay, and again, our work is among the efforts of a series of work going forward. Okay, of course, this effort is largely incomplete towards a so-called unified theory to the mathematical theory for the spiking neural networks. And so we don't have time for this. We don't have time to for introduction to previous methods. But this is a comparison, okay, to the Fokker-Planck equations. To two different types of previous methods. The first type is the so-called Fokker-Planck equation. As we can see that the behavior of DSODE is actually, you can see that the error of the firing rates is usually within a few percent, right? And while the Fokker-Planck can be much higher, and the same story is also true for another type of the a very recent previous work, which is called the refractory density method. You can see that, okay, no matter for what type, no matter for what size for the corresponding neural network, the behavior of the DSODE is usually much better, okay, than the previous methods. Okay, so the discussion over here. Why the DSODE works for finite number of neurons? Again, because it directly traces the number of neurons in each state instead of considering a density. Okay, and why DSODE works for different types of the dynamics, or more specifically, the different level of synchrony over here. Well, you see, to deal with the partial synchrony, we're having that. The DSODE is having that the property that all the neurons in the same states, they're having the same probability to fire or to go into the other states, right? Okay, so a huge difference from our DSODE to the previous methods is actually the crucial how we are dealing with a crucial issue differently. You see, the crucial issue is that if we are taking the dt goes to 0 first, or the delta v goes to 0 at first, right? So the diffusion limit usually asks for the delta v goes to 0 at first, but instead we're asking for dt goes to 0 at first. So this actually successfully allowing for multiple events taking place within the same dt, and that can very naturally lead to the partial synchrony. Okay, and again, our assumption is minimized. We only have the fast self-decorrelation of the current drives, and what we don't need are exactly the large number of neurons, the weak coupling, the temporal homogeneous dynamics. These assumptions, which are largely used in by the previous methods. Okay. So here are some future directions, but I don't think we have the time for that. But one thing that worth noting is that, okay, the transition, the phenomena that we have seen, which is the transition between the multiple attractors, can be further analyzed, okay, by leveraging from the large deviation analysis, and that can be very useful, okay, for the understanding the metastable network dynamics, which are actually used a lot in the modeling for decision makings and planning processes. Okay, so here are the references, and I would like to thank my collaborators, especially Professor Louis Tell at Peking Universities again, and that's all. I'm here for questions.
Thank you so much for your great talk. Okay, now Xian, do you have any question?
Yes. Hello, Zhuo-Cheng. It's a very great talk, and I see that the mathematical elegancy and well, the interesting application in the neuroscience part. Well, I'm doing machine learning more in this side, so I would like to ask if this kinds of modeling could give us any insights into the application of spiking neural networks in real machine learning problems.
Oh, that's actually a very interesting question. So because you see well, okay, first of all, the Markovian framework it gives us the capability of doing a lot of things. For example, very quickly producing the firing rates, no matter for single neurons or for the spiking neural networks, right? So one thing that I'm considering right now, actually I'm working right now, is the ANN-SNN conversion, right? So the context is that, okay, so, well, ANN is very easy to train using the backpropagation. SNN is harder to train, but it's much more energy efficient when you are doing the inference problem. So now the question is that if you are having an ANN, can I always find a corresponding or mathematically equivalent SNN, okay, to do the same job, so I don't have to change any of the network architecture, right? Well, you see that the answer becomes more possible, okay, when you are having the fast estimator of firing rates deduced from the Markovian framework presented, okay, in this talk.
I see. But in such case, well, in most cases, the ANN architecture is not so homogeneous. They are layer by layer. So would this introduce any difficulties in your framework, or you are already trying to tackling with these issues?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. So first of all, I would like to say having very large inhomogeneous network architecture will, of course, lead to a lot of difficulties in the mathematical framework. But one good thing about this is that, okay, in both neuroscience and machine learning, people are talking about something that's called a low-dimensional architecture. The low-dimensional architecture, and which means that the adjacency matrix, okay, sometimes they can be decomposed, okay, into the they may have the low rank architecture, okay, and when that happens, it's actually very reasonable to again cluster them, okay, into the different neural populations. And you see, as you can see that the so let me going out. Okay, let me go out. As you can see that the neural architecture that we're presenting over here, this is actually by nature a low rank architecture. And adding the number of populations, or adding the as long as it's low rank, okay, and adding a few number of the neural populations is actually not a problem at all. Okay, so if that happens, we're good. And however, if there is no low rank architecture at all, and also the network architecture is largely inhomogeneous, and I would say, okay, I'm afraid so far there's very few things that we can do.
I see. Yeah, thank you very much. So yes, this is also ANN conversion. We're also interested in this topic, and well, actually, we did try to manage to find some ways to kind of finding the so-called membrane potential states or whatever. But usually, it's very inaccurate, and these things could be quite helpful for us if we can combine them. So thank you again for this excellent talk. Thanks.
Of course, yeah. So for the fast estimator of the for the fast estimator of the firing rates, actually we are writing a paper on that, and you should be online in 1 or 2 weeks, so
Great,
you can expect
thanks.
that. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? What time is it in Shanghai? Is it like 2?
Oh, it's 2 p.m. Yeah.
2 a.m., right?
2 a.m. You're right. 2
Yeah.
a.m.
Yeah. Thank you so much for staying up so late for this session. Yeah, I think it's time to close the session.
Okay.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you
Thank you
everybody
very
for
much.
joining
Mhm.
us today. Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you.